the situation. First and foremost, I would like to let you know that you are here for Coffee with NNAHRA. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Azadeh Tavakoli. I am the Director of Development for NNAHRA. What we will be doing today is talking with Rick McGee, a distinguished lawyer who resides in Minnesota. Just in case you haven't got to meet him, he is a great resource for Indian country, and on his website, he has been doing an amazing job taking effective time of his being stuck at home, and he's been writing books. So if you go to his website, richardmcgeelaw.com, he's got a couple books that he's newly released, and now he's also written an effective practices for addressing discrimination and workplace in the tribal workspace. I will send you copies of the checklist that he has sent to me. So if you would like to go ahead and list your email address in the chat box, I will go ahead and make sure that that gets over to you. But afterwards, I will also upload it to the members only section of our website. So just in case you miss anything, we'll throw that in there. So first and foremost, good morning, everybody. I hope you guys are all doing well, staying safe and healthy, and hopefully having some mild plans outside. Trying to stay safe with the regulations changing, kids getting antsy, one step at a time. We are planning for our conference in Hawaii. Registration is open. So if you are interested in that, we're starting to build out our schedule, and advertising is going to kick into high gear shortly, and we are just keeping our eye on Oahu. So really excited. I love your puppy, Marnie.
She's misbehaving again, so I'm trying to keep her quiet.
Sitting here so jealous, at work, not at the office, and I'm thinking, I want my dog.
I have to keep her out of the screen not to distract the conversation, right?
Oh, no, it's good, it's good.
She has new pajamas on today.
It's a very casual place that we have built here. So anytime you have conversations, please feel free to unmute and ask your questions. Rick is a conversationalist and loves your input and questions, so please feel free to add them along the way. So without further ado, I'll introduce Richard McGee, attorney and best friend of NNAHRA.
Azadeh, thank you very much for your kind words and the introduction. I see from the names that are on the screens a number of friends and colleagues, and I really appreciate you being here, and I look forward to meeting new friends and colleagues. I also see our president, Judy Wright, has joined us, and grateful that she is here. And I want to bounce the ball to Judy to build on Azadeh's good morning here. So Judy, welcome and nice to see you. It's going to be about 60 degrees here in Minneapolis, and we're celebrating that. But I bet it's nicer in Southern California.
Actually, we're about 60 degrees also. It's kind of a cloudy atmosphere. So thank you, Rick. I just really want to thank everybody for joining us. I am excited to hear this topic of discrimination and also inclusion here. So I'm not going to take too much of your time. I want Rick to go ahead and move on with his presentation.
Judy, thanks again. Really appreciate that. And as Azadeh talked about, if at any point you would like to add or subtract, help talk about this conversation we're going to have, I welcome. Take yourself off mute and dive in if you have a comment or a question as we navigate this. I'd love to have an informal conversation with you all this morning. As Azadeh talked about, I have drafted this effective discrimination book. It's as somebody said that recently received it, it's called Effective Practices for Addressing Discrimination and Harassment in the Tribal Workplace. And she said that title's way too long. And I'm gonna have to agree that title is way too long. And I had the benefit of Judy's input on this before it got published, and others, including Mr. Moore and others. So really benefited from some of their insight in helping me kind of put that together. At the end, I'll talk to you about how you get a copy. These are free. Love to send you a copy. It'll cost you nothing. And I want to share this as a resource. I think it's a resource. So, and other than, rather than wait until the end, if you just send me an email, and tell me how many copies you want. I'll send them to you. So happy to do that. We are going to use the checklist in about 20 minutes. I want to talk about some preliminary things, but there is a consolidated checklist from this book. It's on my website. It'll be on the members only aspect of NAHRA's website, and Azade's helping me out here in sharing that with you. And in a little bit, I do want to refer to that, so it will be beneficial if you're able to put your hands on it. But to the extent that you're not able, you might be on a telephone right now, I will try to address that portion of the presentation with the understanding that you might not be able to review that PDF here this morning. So thank you very much to NAHRA. These coffees have been fantastic. I really enjoyed the conversations, and I've really enjoyed some of the conversations afterwards. I've been hearing from friends and colleagues afterwards, and they've been talking about how much they appreciate the fact that NAHRA brings this and try to bring it in a practical way. And talking to Azadeh about the topics ahead of time, you know, she really wants, on behalf of NAHRA, to make this practical and useful for our members, and I really appreciate that message. So I'm very hopeful that the conversation that we're going to have today is practical and useful in your practices. So I want to talk about inherent sovereignty. And when I talk about sovereignty, I always think about the ability for the tribe to define its own rules. And that is a definition of sovereignty. But sovereignty is so much more than that. It's tribal language, it's tradition and custom, it's land, it's economic diversification, it's many, many things. So I want to do it justice. I want to talk about sovereignty as a big idea, but also included in those 8 or 9 or 10 pillars of sovereignty, it is the ability to define our own rules. And NAHRA has really been a strong advocate behind sovereignty. And one of the ways that we express our sovereignty is through tribal law. And the federal law and the state laws, they've got a ton of that stuff. But one of the best ways that we as tribes can express our sovereignty, define the rules so that they reflect our traditions and customs, our values and our goals, is through our laws. In addition to that, NAHRA has always been strong on having clear policies and procedures that we can enforce, that employees understand, that supervisors and managers and directors understand. So that's a critical aspect of this as well. When it comes to discrimination and harassment and civil rights and employment-related principles, when it comes to sovereignty or inherent sovereignty, the idea that we get to define the rules for ourselves, and not because we have permission from the United States or not because we have permission from a state, but it's inherent to tribes to be able to define our own rules. But I think when it comes to employment rules generally and discrimination and harassment more specifically, we have a too many choices problem. That's the phrase I've written down on my notes here this morning. And if you're a note taker, I'm calling this the too many choices problem. And what do I mean by too many choices? Well, think about just leave. When we look at your employee handbook, you've got 10 pages of leave in your employee handbooks, whether it's FMLA or leave of absence or short-term disability or bereavement or cultural. We can go on and on, can't we? We've got all of these different kinds of leave. And then within that, we've got a whole bunch of decisions, too many choices about how many weeks, who you have to ask for permission for, et cetera, et cetera. When it comes to wages and benefits, when it comes to, are we an at-will employer or a for-cause employer? What do our grievances look like? Again, too many choices, way too many choices. So with sovereignty, with inherent sovereignty, the ability to define our own rules, it is fantastic. And I couldn't agree more with NAHRA that this is a critical aspect of what we do as tribal organizations, making sure that we enhance and preserve the sovereignty that we inherently have as tribes. But what's on the other side of that coin? The responsibility to get it right. And I think this is hard. I think this is really hard. So we've got all of these choices, but how do we look at the sea of choices, these many, many choices, and how do we choose the right one? And what is our role in choosing the right one in a responsible way? And as HR professionals, I'm speaking to the crowd here, I'm playing to the crowd in that you guys are used to this balancing act every day, making sure that we are balancing between an employer's rights and an employee's rights and trying to navigate through that in choosing the right laws and policies to respect both camps, if you will, both employer and employee. When it comes to too many choices, I want to give you 3 quick non-employment examples just to kind of illustrate too many choices. The first one, think about hiring someone. If you have 2 candidates, 2 qualified candidates, isn't that easier than having 10? Having 10 is nice, right? You get to choose all of these people, but now it's operation over. My brain is overloaded with these 10 people I've got to sort through that are all qualified for this position. It's easier to only have 2 choices. Think about McDonald's. I'm thinking about McDonald's. It's not even lunchtime. I want to have the Big Mac, the quarter pounder. I want to have the 12 McNuggets and ice cream, right? So there's too many choices at McDonald's. So I think we suffer from that as well. And then don't get me started about pizza, right? Thin crust, thick crust. Now they got cheese in the crust, sausage, onion, pepperoni. And who wants to have pineapple on their pizza? Well, unless you're going to the NNAHRA conference in September, nobody wants pineapple on their pizza except for Azadeh. She's got her hand up for some crazy reason, right? So Marnie does as well. I don't understand these pineapple loving pizza lovers. So, but you're getting my point, right? Too many choices. So why do we have too many choices when it comes to discrimination and harassment? Well, I always talk about Target and Walmart. Target and Walmart are our non-native employers. They don't have too many choices. Why? They have to pay attention to federal and state law. It's mandated for them. So when it comes to discrimination and harassment, the book is already written for them. The laws are there, and then their policies are there to interpret those laws. And it's complicated. I think this area of the law is complicated, discrimination, harassment. But I think it's more complicated for us because Target and Walmart don't have any choices in what to comply with. That prescription, that formula is already defined for them. Why is it that we're different? Well, we're inherently sovereign, and we start from the idea that we are in charge as tribes. And then from there, we know that we don't have to, generally speaking, we don't have to pay attention to state employment laws. And that's because of our inherent sovereignty and because of that 1832 Supreme Court decision, Wooster v. Georgia. And if I make any cites, any cases, or any rules, send me an email if you want a copy of any of this stuff or some articles that deal with any of these things. So as a general rule, we don't have to pay attention to state discrimination and harassment laws because those laws do not apply to us because of our inherent sovereignty. Now, Judy Wright, our colleague out in California, her tribe, San Pasqual, has signed a compact with California in the gaming arena, and she has to pay attention to some state rules as the vice president of human resources for the casino. But if we walk across the parking lot and we talk to her colleague in human resources at the tribe, they don't have to pay attention to California law because the compact doesn't reach the tribe, it only reaches the casino. So there's always some exceptions, right? General rule, we don't have to pay attention to state human resources laws, employment laws, but sometimes we have to look at the details, and in some instances, if we've signed a compact or if we've left our lands and we open a healthcare clinic in downtown Seattle or in downtown Tulsa, now we might have to pay attention to Oklahoma or Washington or whatever law. So we always talk, generally speaking, state law doesn't apply, but we've just talked about a couple exceptions where it might influence some of what we're doing. When it comes to federal laws, we have that question, do federal employment laws apply? The answer is yes, no, and maybe. We don't like that answer because I think it's super confusing, but it's a lot less confusing when it comes to discrimination and harassment. Why? Because Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, race, religion, national origin, gender, or sex, that law does not apply to us. And then the Americans with Disabilities Act, disability, that law does not apply to us. Well, how about age? Well, maybe that law applies, and there's some other potential civil rights, but generally speaking, federal employment laws in the civil rights arena do not apply to us. So what does that bring us back to? So Walmart and Target, the laws are written for them, and they are locked into what they have to do. For us, the laws are not written for us because we're inherently sovereign, and because generally speaking, state and federal civil rights laws do not apply to us. What does that bring us? Well, a celebration because we get to exercise our sovereignty. But it's back to the too many choices problem, isn't it? And I think that is a challenge. What are we going to do? I've got this blank piece of paper I'm showing you just as an illustration. What are we going to do to fill this blank piece of paper so it's fair, both to us as employers and to our employees? And that's what I want to talk to you about a little bit. I've set the stage for that conversation now, and I want to spend a little bit of time talking about filling that blank piece of paper, and how do we deal with all of these choices, too many choices at McDonald's, too many choices in the freezer section when we buy pizza, right? And too many choices when it comes to employment-related rules. How are we going to fill our piece of paper in a responsible way? And that's where I want to shift gears here. At this point, any comments or questions before we shift gears and talk about how we actually do this?
Currently not yet. And if anybody is shy to come off as speaker, please feel free to know that if you want to type your questions in the chat box, we will happily read them for you. And I will also be adding Rick's email address in case you wanted to contact him.
Azadeh, thank you very much. Let's talk about civil rights. And I want to use a couple terms here, and I'm going to speak our language here, so we kind of agree to what that language looks like. So whether we call it civil rights in the workplace, or we talk about ourselves as equal opportunity employers, we just talked about the same exact thing. So equal opportunity employers, respecting civil rights in the workplace, that's exactly the same concept. So as a tribal employer, are you an equal opportunity rights employer? Well, no, not because of what Washington, D.C. says, not because of what the federal government says, not because of what the state says. You are an equal opportunity employer because of what you say, what our tribal leaders say. That's when we are equal opportunity employers. As we navigate into equal opportunity employment, I want to recognize another one of our NAHRA colleagues. Mr. Tal Moore has joined us. Good morning, Tal. Hey, Tal, good morning. How are you? Good to see you. Thank you very much for joining us. So when it comes to equal opportunity employment, I want to talk a little bit about not making any employment decision. And we always think about hiring and firing, don't we? But I want to expand equal opportunity employment and civil rights to all aspects of employment-related decision making. So we don't make any hiring, no firing, no promotion, no training. And then just as importantly, do I respect you in the workplace as your boss, as your colleague? How I treat you with that respect should have no connection whatsoever to the following protected traits or characteristics. So I want to use that as a term of art: protected traits, protected characteristics, protected classifications, if you will. I just said the same thing, or similar things 3 times. So when it comes to race and religion and national origin, sex or gender, age or disability, sexual orientation, pregnancy, how you voted, what your party affiliation is, your genetic information, we can go on and talk about these protected traits or protected classifications. So 99% of the time, those protected traits and classifications should be out of bounds in making any and all employment-related decisions. And there's a connection. I always hold my hands up, I cross my arms and say there's a connection between negative employment behavior and those protected traits or characteristics. If we have that connection, if I'm picking on you, if I'm refusing to hire you, or if I'm firing you because of your race, your religion, your national origin, that is the beginning of the conversation when it comes to discrimination and harassment. So are you an equal opportunity employer? You are if you say you are, and if you are, if you actually deliver on that promise. What I'm looking for, and as the checklist is going to reveal, we're looking for that promise in your handbook. And I'm looking for it in the first chapter or second chapter of the handbook. So I want to see this early. I want to see this promise to your employees that when they come to work, they will be protected. We have made this promise to our employees that we will not utilize protected traits or characteristics in making any or all employment decisions. All right, what's the one exception? So I said 99%. 99% of the time, race, religion, national origin is irrelevant, is immoral in making employment decisions. Well, most of them are 100%. But let's talk about disability for a moment. If I'm hiring someone to be a lifeguard, and that person, unfortunately, cannot utilize their legs, well, they're not able to perform the essential function of the job of running across the sandy beach and swimming out and rescuing the struggling swimmer. In that very rare instance, I can use that person's disability and conclude that they cannot perform the essential function of the job. And therefore, I can close the door to that opportunity for them if in fact they cannot use their legs or a substitute, whatever that happens to be. But when it comes to the payroll clerk position, the fact that that person's in a wheelchair and can't utilize their legs has no impact whatsoever. It's not an advantage. It clearly is not a disadvantage. So 99% of the time, the protected traits and characteristics are not taken into account in making any decisions. But once in a while, we do have an exception. But before we exercise that exception, we're definitely going to talk to our friends in human resources and then maybe talk to our in-house lawyers about that. All right. So we've got all of these decisions to make when it comes to protected traits and characteristics. So if we are going to write on our blank piece of paper, here's our blank piece of paper, what are we going to write in the absence of state and federal law? So from a first step, second step standpoint, it's always tribe first. So what has the tribe done from a law or a policy or both perspective in defining what protected classifications are? So have we defined race, religion, national origin, sex, or gender? What does that list look like? Going back a little bit further, what are our values? What are our traditions and customs? I've heard some presenters, not in this space, but in large conferences say, hey, you can't hug anybody at work. Well, if you've ever been in a tribal workplace, there is some hugging going on depending on the tribe that you're working with. So what is your value? What do you want to address? What do you want to deal with? What kind of a culture do you want to create? And since we've got this blank piece of paper, and we're not tied like Walmart and Target to the way that people interpret federal and state law, in my view, we can define those rules. I think there are some outer limits, and I think HR professionals should be kind of a guidepost on some outer limits. But when it comes to certain things that we want to tolerate and accept or not tolerate and accept in the workplace, I think we're able to define those things through our policy, our training, and our enforcement, et cetera. In addition to looking at the laws and policies we have in our books, how are we doing when it comes to harassment and discrimination in the workplace? What's our reputation as an employer? I think that's kind of the second question I'd like to ask. How are we doing? And if we're doing well, we don't want to reinvent something that we're already doing well, and we want to stick with those principles and practices. But to the extent that we have fallen a little bit short in meeting our expectations when it comes to discrimination in the workplace, it's time to do a little bit of self-examination, a little introspection to see how we're doing. And I think that will help us put ink on that paper, to help us define our policies and procedures. So first, big step, tribe first. Let's look at what we have. Let's look at our laws and our policies. Let's look at our practices. Let's look at our procedures and human resources. Let's look at the state of our training materials. How are we following up? How are we investigating these things? All of the ingredients that you guys are also familiar with when it comes to dealing with discrimination and harassment. Let's take the patient's temperature, the patient's blood pressure, and see how they turn out on that. In addition to that, if we just say tribe first and tribe only, I think we're missing an opportunity to look at what the federal and state sovereigns have done. Because there are some good practices that the federal and state sovereigns have put together. There are many rules and laws and court decisions that we can look at, not as control, but as guidance. Some things that the federal sovereign has developed. There are some confusing things in the federal law for me, but there are some principles that we can look at in helping us evaluate our own practices. The other challenge that I have is when you go to an American law school, what do they teach you? They don't teach you Native American law, they teach you American law. They talk to you about what the United States is up to, not what the local tribe is up to. So if you ask a lawyer about discrimination and harassment, oftentimes you get United States law and United States regulations because that's where their training comes from. So that can be a benefit in that lawyer or that HR professional may have some understanding of how the rules work and where they are successful and where they're not. But it also can be a crutch, can't it? Because if we simply rely on what the United States has done, or the state of California or Washington or Minnesota, that becomes a little bit of a crutch, and then we're not examining what the tribe wants and what the tribe's values and traditions are. But even with that, I still think that we should spend a little bit of time thinking about what the federal and state sovereigns do. So this brings us to the checklist, and you have either downloaded the checklist by going to my site, or Azadeh has shared that with you. So we got 2 thumbs up from Azadeh. So I'd like to transition to the checklist here in a moment or two, and talk about how we do this. But why the checklist? So as Azadeh talked to you about, COVID has given me an opportunity. Since I'm not traveling, I've used some of my weekends to develop and try to enhance some of my practices so I can better serve my colleagues. And this started off as an effort to improve discrimination and harassment training, because I've had the benefit of doing a lot of it, and I wasn't 100% satisfied with the content. And I kept on struggling with this idea that tribes are sovereign in this area, but so many of my slides look like slides that would be delivered at a Walmart or a Target training. So I wanted to spend some time talking about and breaking this down and really examining what I'm delivering. And it started off as a 3-page checklist, and I was pretty happy. And then I went back to it and it became a 13-page checklist and a short book. So you just can't stop the momentum sometimes, and I'm hoping that this thing is value add. And the philosophy behind the checklist is I can't keep all of these concepts in my mind. There's too many concepts. And I thought about, the old saying, how do you eat an elephant? Well, you eat an elephant one bite at a time, right? So if we are going to unpack discrimination and harassment, since I can't keep all the concepts in my head at once, I'm not smart enough or insightful for that, I needed to break it down. I needed to break it down into smaller pieces, and then I needed to break down the smaller pieces into smaller pieces. And that's all the checklist does. So as an overview, there's really 3 phases in the checklist. Phase number 1, what do your policies look like? What do your policies look like? And then I'm going to have 3 respectful recommendations under policy. I think that you should have a general discrimination and harassment policy, and I will describe that in a moment. Next, number 2, under policy, I think you should have a sexual harassment policy. And I want to talk about that. Why is there a distinction between general harassment and sexual harassment? And then third, I think you should have a bully or respect policy. And I get the criticism behind bully and respect. You can't define it, and I can't either. I've got a sample policy. I think I do have one in the book, and it's not very good because it's too general. But taking that criticism, I want to talk to you about why I think it's still valid to have a respect or bullying policy and why it's important. Okay, so the book is broken, the checklist, and the book is broken down into really 3 segments: policy, and then underneath that policy, general harassment, discrimination, sexual harassment, and then bullying. Phase number 2 in the book, from policy to training. And when it comes to training, we're not just thinking about the formal training that you do every 1 or 2 or 3 years. I want to make it a bigger discussion than that. So in addition to the formal training that we do, which is, I think, necessary, what are our managers and directors doing to further the conversation? What are they doing from an informal and a formal manner? Are they comfortable with having these conversations when somebody comes to their office? What is tribal council's role when it comes to training and reinforcing these principles? So I want to make training much more than just the formal training. But if we do think about the formal training, what are the ingredients necessary in formal training? What are we looking for? And the checklist hopefully gives us a barometer, a measuring stick for some of the ways that good formal training meets and exceeds expectations. Okay, so number 1, what are we doing from a policy standpoint? Number 2, what are we doing from a training standpoint? And then number 3, which I think is the most difficult, what are we doing from the enforcement standpoint? Because if we have awesome policy, and you do, if we have outstanding training, and you do, it's enforcement where we fail. Not where you fail, but for employers that miss the mark here, it's the unwillingness to enforce the rules, mostly against popular employees. That's where this is hard, isn't it? And I don't want to underestimate how hard this is, because when it comes to enforcement, enforcement doesn't have to be termination, but it could include termination. It might include more education. It might include discipline in some form. It might include termination of employment. We want to gauge that in a way that's appropriate. But these are very, very difficult conversations sometimes. People that we really like, haven't made many mistakes, are outstanding performers, but they made a big mistake when it came to touching another employee inappropriately. So we've got to have the willingness to enforce these rules, and that can be very, very difficult. And in my experience, this is where, if we're going to fall a little short, this is where we will fall a little bit short. So policy, training, enforcement is the way that the checklists in the book are organized. And then there are, so those are, if we're eating the elephant, those are the 3 big bites. And then within each of those big bites, we're going to chew a little bit. I'm not sure I like this metaphor anymore. We're going to chew a little bit underneath each of those and break that down a little bit. If you've got the checklist in front of you, then I'm going to turn to page 2 of the checklist. And on my page 2, at the bottom half, it says respectful recommendation. So I want to.
What I can do is I can pull it up and put it on the screen if you like.
You know, that'd be awesome, Azadeh. Thank you very much. So as Azadeh does this, this is I called an audit checklist, and it's designed for you all to do this because you're extremely insightful from my conversations with you. You're extremely insightful on how all of this works. And so Azadeh, your page 2 is a little different than my page 2. If you could go back up, and maybe I did not give you the one that I'm working from. And so can you go one more page up, please? Oh, there we go, right there. So we're on page 1. My page 1 is a cover page. So what we're looking for is that respectful recommendation. And this checklist and the book is designed so that you're able to go through the checklist on your own and celebrate where you meet and exceed expectations. And you are clearly going to do that. You're going to go through this checklist and say, yep, we do that. Yep, we do that. And you're going to go through the checklist to celebrate where you meet and exceed. In addition to that, the checklist is designed to start a conversation about where you can improve. are there opportunities where we can get a little bit better in 2021 at dealing with these very important topics called discrimination, harassment, and bullying? If you do that, if you actually do the audit, the self-audit with this checklist, I'm going to ask you to collaborate with your in-house lawyers. Why? Because of the attorney-client privilege. I want the paperwork and the work that you do to be protected by privilege. And the reason is if you do get sued a year from now or 2 years from now, if the person that sues you because of discrimination and harassment finds out that you did this audit, they're going to want the paperwork that you did when you did this audit. Well, they won't be able to have it if you work with your in-house lawyer. And your in-house lawyer doesn't have to be with you at the meetings. All you have to do is tell your in-house lawyer that we're going to do this audit as an HR department. And then you're going to do the work, and then you're going to send a copy of the audit to your in-house lawyer and ask for their opinion. That's enough, in my view, to form and establish the attorney-client privilege. Because of the work that you've done in auditing your practices is protected by the attorney-client privilege, if you get sued, and the chances of being sued are small, but if you get sued, you don't have to produce the audit. Well, why is that important? Well, it won't be important on the things that you're doing well. But if you identify 3 things that you're not doing today that you should be doing as a best practices employer, and if you don't fix those between now and when that victim sues you, you're in trouble. Because you've admitted that your policies and your practices are not consistent with best practice and you didn't fix them. So I want to caution you against utilizing this audit without collaborating with your in-house counsel. That's what this paragraph is all about. And again, your in-house counsel doesn't have to be at every meeting, but they have to play some role in you telling them that you're doing this and then asking for their advice. So then those documents will become protected under privilege. All right, so that's my respectful recommendation. Let's talk a little bit about, before we go to the checklist, one more thing before we go to the checklist. I want to talk to you about an opportunity where I think when it comes to the federal law, it's too complicated, at least too complicated for me. So when we start talking about hostile work environments and quid pro quo and disparate impact and disparate treatment, I get lost in a whole bunch of words and it doesn't have a lot of meaning to me sometimes. So I think there's an opportunity to make this clearer, not more simple, but clearer for our employees, both our managers and our directors and the employees that we're protecting. And the way that I like to think about discrimination and harassment is 2 ways. I like to think about it as discrimination, as closing the door to opportunity. If you're a note taker, please write that down. Think about discrimination as closing the door to opportunity, closing the door to opportunity. Then I like to think about harassment as a toxic work environment, a toxic work environment. And when I send you the book, all of this is addressed in chapter 1. So you don't have to take detailed notes, but if you'd like to, great. So let's talk about discrimination as closing the door to opportunity. So everything with discrimination and harassment is connected to the protected classifications. If I don't hire you, or if I fire you, or if I don't promote you, I'm closing the door to opportunity, aren't I? I'm looking for some heads to nod. Yep. So if I don't hire you, if I fire you, if I don't promote you, if I don't give you important work so you can be promoted, I am closing the door to opportunity. And if I'm doing that because you're a man, because you're a woman, because you're from Canada, national origin, because you're too old or too young, or because of your sexual orientation, or because of that perceived disability, if I'm doing those things based on those protected traits and classifications, I'm discriminating against you. That's my clearer version of discrimination. On the other hand, if I'm creating a toxic work environment by calling you names, by touching you inappropriately, by showing you pornography, if I'm creating a toxic work environment based on what? Based on those protected traits and characteristics. I'm calling you names because you're from Canada. I'm calling you names because I don't respect women. I'm creating a toxic work environment. That's harassment. It is all connected. I'm crossing my arms again. It's all connected to the protected class list, but I like think about discrimination as closing the door to opportunity. I like thinking about harassment as creating a toxic work environment. That's clearer to me than all the ins and outs of federal and some state laws. And that's the way I like to think about it from a policy standpoint. That's the way I like to think about it from a training standpoint. The checklist uses that as a guide, but then it also returns to some of those state and federal standards as well. So those state and federal standards are not lost in this checklist, but just as a general way of thinking about it, both from a policy, training, and enforcement standpoint, if you agree with that approach, I think it's clearer than getting into some of the weeds and some of the details that we tend to when in talking about discrimination and harassment. All right. So now let's go to our checklist. And when it comes to discrimination and harassment checklist, this first page that Azadeh has pulled up, it's a list in your checklist that says, what should we look at? How should we take our own temperature? What are some of the influences on us as a tribe? If you happen to have a constitution, what does your constitution say about equal protection and due process? How has that been interpreted? That might influence the way that we handle discrimination and harassment. Next, do we have as a tribe some discrimination laws on the books, harassment laws on the books? Next, what has tribal council said from a resolution standpoint? Have they discussed this in the past? That's an influencer on us. Next, what about our policies and procedures? Have we updated those recently? How have we updated those? Have we gotten some feedback from our HR professionals, from our leadership team? When it comes to investigations, policies, and procedures, do we have qualified folks to do those kinds of things? And then as you can read for yourself in navigating through that list. So we want to do a little bit of self-assessment here. How are we doing with this? And then we want to celebrate the fact that we're already doing things well, and where can we improve? How can we make sure that we are meeting our tribe's values, our traditions and customs, our goals and objectives? All right. And then it says, look at our training, et cetera, et cetera. Let's move down, Azadeh, if you will, please. And then as you can see at the bottom of this page, we've got some policies, and it says general considerations. And then Azadeh, as she scrolls down to the next page, there's a whole bunch of spots there where you can put an X or strike a check mark there, where there are a number of additional, just very general considerations. And I'm not going to go through those, but as you can see, we've taken the 3 bites of the elephant and we've really broken it down into many, many small things. And then as Azadeh, if she'll pause just there, as we can see there at kind of the middle of the screen, it says tribal employers promulgate 3 policies working together. Discrimination, harassment, that's our general discrimination, harassment. What do we mean by that? That is discrimination and harassment based on any and all of the protected classifications that the tribe defines: race, religion, national origin, gender, orientation, pregnancy, age, disability, et cetera, et cetera. Sexual harassment is more precise. But as we saw, sex and gender is probably already dealt with in your general harassment policy. But we've got to get them all. We have to get that net and capture all of the categories, don't we? And then typically we have a sexual harassment policy, not because it's more important, and this is a really important thing, not because it's more important, but because there's more of it. So sexual harassment is no more obnoxious than me harassing you because of your race or your religion. So why is it special? Why do we have sexual harassment in our policies? It's because there's more of it in a typical workplace. And we just want to deal with it in greater detail. And then the checklist talks about quid pro quo and hostile work. And hostile work is super misunderstood. And then why is there bullying up there? Some of my colleagues don't like bullying because it's too broad. But I want to have a place where I can have, on my left hand, I want to have discrimination and harassment. Those are the things that we can be sued over. That's where our legal risk is in discrimination and harassment. In 32 years of doing this, I have never had an employer sued for bullying or for lack of respect. Said a different way, it's really hard to get sued over bullying or lack of respect. But as you all know, it's super important to deal with it in the workplace. That's why I want to draw a distinction between what's on my left hand, the things I can get sued over, discrimination and harassment, and what's on my right hand, things I want to deal with, I want to manage in the workplace, but I don't want to be sued on. And I want to make sure my policies are very clear to separate these out, and I want my managers to understand the difference, because employees do not understand the difference. When Grumpy Gus is telling an employee to be on time when they've been late 9 days in a row, and they sense a little frustration from Grumpy Gus, they think that Grumpy Gus is creating a hostile work environment. But there is no hostile work environment, because that's a subset of discrimination and harassment. And there can't be a hostile work environment when there's not the intersection of gender, sex, race, etc. So we want to make sure that we create a difference in our policies and procedures and our practices between the risky stuff, discrimination and harassment, and the less risky stuff, bullying and respect, but we have to manage all of it. That's the critical aspect of it. And then as Azadeh helps us out, if we scroll down below those three, you can see general harassment and discrimination, and then we see a whole bunch of places where we can check next to general harassment. And then if Azadeh helps us out, we'll scroll down a little bit more, and we're going to get way down, maybe even on the next page. Oh, there it is. There's sexual harassment right there at the bottom of page 4. And then we see a whole bunch of suggestions on sexual harassment as Azadeh continues to scroll here. And then I think we're going to get to bullying, and there's bullying at the bottom there. And you're going to see that bullying is really, really short. It's only, what is it, 4 or 5 bullets there, because there's not a whole lot of guidance there. Why is there not a whole lot of guidance? No protected class conversation when it comes to bullying. So discrimination and harassment, I'm holding my hands together. They're really, really narrow definitions. But bullying is a really broad definition. And that can be good and bad, because when you have such a general policy, those are hard to manage. But I still believe in a bullying policy because there's too much of it. There's too much lack of respect, and there's too much bullying in the workplace. I want to address it while recognizing the shortcoming of any policy I draft in this area. And then if Azadeh helps us, I want to move through the slide here. There's training, and we see orientation there, really, really important. But as important, you see manager reminders. Our managers have to be on board here. The conversation cannot end at orientation. And then it gives some recommendations of what our managers can do to continue that conversation, maybe with the assistance of the good folks in human resources, because sometimes our managers don't speak this language, but you all do. So we need to encourage our managers to continue the conversation. And then Azadeh, if you'll help us out, move down a little bit here. There's some organization training. So what are some of the ingredients of our more formal training? We'll move down a little bit more. And then the training sessions for everyone. Let's continue, please, Azadeh. Sorry to interrupt your flow. We continue here, and let's go to the next major break right there, enforcement. All right. So we see victim report to managers, and what does that look like? What should our managers be thinking about in that first conversation? Where should that meeting be held? What are some things that the manager can say to help that employee understand how important it is that they are there reporting this? And if we'll scroll down to page 10 here, please. And a lot about managers there because it's critical, but then there's human resources there at the bottom of page 10. Having an intake process. What does your intake process look like? Do you have a form? What does the form say? And if we'll scroll down a little bit more beyond human resources, and then letter C there on page 11, respectful recommendations for leadership. So I don't want to tell tribal council what to do, but I am here, right? So I've got some respectful recommendations for our leaders, whether it's the chairman of the board or committee, or tribal council, or our principal chief, etc. So what are some of the things that our leaders can help us out with. And I think this is a critical conversation for leaders as well. And then we'll scroll down a little bit more here to D, just went past, and then decision in response to the facts. This is a critical aspect of enforcement. We want to make sure that we are enforcing the policy. And if there is a violation, what does that mean? Is it more education? Is it a suspension without pay? Is it a termination? Can we rehire that person? And there's some guidance there as well. And then I'd like to tell you what's on the next page. I can't remember anymore. We're too far into the presentation. What's next here, Azadeh? So we got a little bit more there on the decision making. That brings us to the end. So really appreciate that, Azadeh. Thanks for helping us out. I want to leave some time for some questions and answers. But before we do that, just a couple quick takeaways here. Number one, this is a conversation about sovereignty. Part of this conversation is above my pay grade. We need the guidance from the good folks in HR, maybe legal, but we also need our leaders involved in this conversation as well. What are we going to protect? What are our values? What does our protected class list look like? It's also a conversation about fairness and human dignity. When people go to work, they need to be respected, don't they? And that's how we attract and retain good people. Next, the audit should be a collaboration with our in-house counsel. Remember the attorney-client privilege. It's an important aspect of this. Next, we want to make sure that if you agree with my buckets, we're meeting and exceeding best practices when it comes to policy, training, and enforcement. That's the way I think about these things, as those three buckets. And then underneath those buckets, how many check marks are we doing? Let's celebrate the check marks when we are doing things well. Then let's start a conversation with our colleagues, our in-house lawyers, our HR professionals, and our leaders about how we can better deliver dignity and fairness in the workplace. I'd like to send you the book. You can't buy the book. You just send me an email and I send it to you. How easy is that? And if you want more than one copy, if you really want to be bored and you want more than one copy, let me know. But I want to bounce the ball to you all. Thanks again to Azadeh, Judy, and Tal, and NNAHRA for the privilege of having this conversation. Thank you for the time that we spent together here this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are. But Azadeh, any comments or questions or any feedback from you, Judy, Tal?
Definitely. No, I really do appreciate, like, when we have our handbooks and we have our discrimination and sexual harassment, you're adding a really important piece of making sure that the bullying is in there, because we talk about it quite often in our conferences on here's how we can identify it, here's what we can watch training videos, but if it's not in our policies, we can't enforce it, we can't build our culture around anti-bullying. So I really do appreciate that that's in there. Judy?
A lot of great information, Rick. You know, I'm even going to go back in our handbook and see where we have harassment positions, you know, if we have it in the front of the book. I think it all comes down to respect, doing the right thing, and making sure everybody's comfortable in their work environment. But so much good information. Thank you. Tal?
Tal?
Good morning, everybody. Mr. McGee, gosh darn it, love you, man. I wrote it in the chat room. You're the champion of HR across Indian country, and those aren't just simple words to say. One thing I'll just put out there to all of our colleagues, and it's great to see everybody and see names on here, is to evaluate internally your safe spaces. I find that we don't have enough safe places for employees to go to report, and then without being told, oh, well, now you reported it, now I'm going to do something. Instead, it's like listen and absorb and then direct instead of take action. Sometimes we know we need to in HR, but yet if we're the activators, some people will be afraid to seek us out because it doesn't feel as safe. So who are our safe havens and places, and then activate from there. And Rick, yeah, always learn something, several nuggets taken away today. And shout out to the Kalispell team, they're here in force. And shout out to Judy's team with San Pasquale and Valley View, they're here in force. Good to see everybody, Tim and all the other great faces and names. Rick, thanks.
Thank you all for your kind words. And just to build on a couple of those things, I just had a conversation with a tribe that is not represented here. And when I said that an employee, a victim of discrimination harassment, should have every opportunity to go to human resources, they gave me a little pushback. And they were telling me I didn't believe in the chain of command. And I said, I believe in the chain of command 90% of the time. And when it comes to absenteeism and being late and the myriad of other employment related issues, the chain of command needs to be respected. But this, from a discrimination harassment standpoint, this is an exception. Just like a whistleblower has to be an exception, because sometimes Rick is your supervisor and I'm the one harassing you. So one aspect of the checklist and training is the ability to depart from the chain of command and find that safe space that Tal talked about. Because if I'm locked in the chain of command and I'm not able to raise my hand and go to somebody in human resources, which can help me evaluate this and evaluate some solutions, then I'm locked out of that safe space that Tal talked about. And then when we do get to our manager and we do get to human resources, is this just one more problem that I've got to deal with? Or am I going to open myself up and be part of the solution? And I think that's got to be part of the conversation as well, and not, jump into that judgmental, why are you here again? Why are you complaining again? I've got this attitude that you can hear in my voice, right? Or am I being grateful that the employee has the courage to bring this workplace challenge to me as a director manager or as an HR professional? So I really appreciate those comments. Thank you, folks. Any other comments or questions, Azadeh, from our colleagues?
This is your opportunity to unmute and feel welcome to ask Rick any questions. Judy, Tal, Anthony, Mike, Tal.
I just want to say, and I'm sure it's been brought up, but Rick he's a good lawyer, but he's a terrible salesman. And this is the trifecta. This is the trifecta of the Rick McGee series. If you don't have all three of them, we're in the losing game. So Amazon, Bing it, Rick, wherever you want to sell it. But I just want to say these are the best. Judy wrote a forward on one of them. I had the privilege of writing on one. So any one of you in the room, Mike Caputo and others, get in line, because Rick's got about 10 more books to write. There you go, Mr. McGee.
That is super nice, Tal. Thank you.
Rick, I just want to say, I really appreciate the passion and the simplicity and the way you break down complex topics and ideas and put them in a way that we can implement them into our everyday responsibilities and duties. I think one of the things that that struck me that I wrote down today was the on the onset, like in the beginning of a team member's career, laying out that due process and where they can go and the safe place for them to get there is really important. It's something that we definitely do in our orientation. We make sure that we spend a full day with them and we explain all those things. And I think the one thing that is really important is we can get into this us and them mentality sometimes. And when you break down an HR department by individual and by person, it's hard to do the us and them, because I think each one of our new hires and even our managers and leaders have all came through our process. When they think about Mike or Judy or Lori or Jed or the faces that help onboard them, it makes it a little less intimidating for them to come to us when they have a problem. And Tal, I think you hit that right on the head with we don't want to be seen always as the activators. So we have to listen, we have to be compassionate. Although we know our responsibility is to do something, they need to know when they're walking out that we're going to take the time to get the outcome that we're looking for. So those are just some takeaways today. These are always great conversations and topics, so I really appreciate it.
Mike, really well said. Thank you very much for your kind words. And you're 100% right that orientation has to be more than just, filling out benefits forms, right? We have to have that conversation, that introduction to the HR, and really appreciate how articulate those comments were. Thank you.
And Edith has a really great question, and we all understand what our training should be, but how has everyone planned to do a company harassment training during the pandemic? Does anybody have any feedback on how you've hopefully successfully transitioned that process?
Zoom. We've all become Zoom experts here at Valley View.
Did you know that Zoom fatigue is a real thing that's being diagnosed now?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I learned that yesterday and I thought, oh, that's what that is.
Yeah.
And Edith, another thing that we did was we recorded our videos and uploaded them to YouTube. So just in case people aren't able to attend a live session, we can record it, upload it to YouTube, and then you can actually watch the statistics of how long individuals watched the video, and even maybe adding a quiz at the end just to make sure that they got it. And Marnie said it was Zoom fatigue.
Yeah, we've thought about that. We're thinking we wouldn't get such a big turnout with the YouTube. What if they don't watch it? And if it's a mandatory, like especially for California, that we give that training. So we kind of want to make sure we're just talking about it. You know, how we're gonna do it. Maybe bringing them in small groups and having them sit there and watch some kind of, you know, YouTube videos or something. Richard, also, you came to our last harassment training that we had here. And I really liked your presentation. And you said that our policies were good. So, I mean, I think we're kind of on the right track. But yeah, we were just trying to plan. I think we have to do one each year for California. So.
Thank you very much for the kind words. When you get the book also incorporates those California regulations to make it California compliant. And there's a lot of common sense in there. New York also has a lot of very sophisticated requirements for their employers, but I felt the California rules were a little clearer. And so I've baked those. You'll see some footnotes in the book on those. So yeah, again, doesn't control, but a guidepost for best practices.
Thank you, April. It looks like she's also been using a LMS system that would have simple videos on harassment. So thank you for adding that. And if you happen to would be willing to share the name, I think that could be helpful for some. Any last minute comments as we wrap up? I do want to be respectful of your time. I do know that we went slightly over, but as always, Rick McGee keeps us enthralled the whole entire hour and definitely always learning more. So thank you everybody for joining us. We will again have this downloaded and uploaded to the members only website along with the checklist. If anybody didn't receive the checklist, please feel free to leave the email address on the chat box. And if you're interested in a copy of the book, I did list Rick McGee's email address above. So please feel free to take your time to send him a message and he can get that wonderful book over to you. So thank you again, everyone, and we do look forward to hopefully seeing you guys register for the annual conference that we are having in Hawaii. I am wearing my flower, just in case you didn't notice. I'm trying to get myself in the space. It's going to happen, and we're going to make it happen, and be very cautious of respectful spaces. But if you have your vaccine, it's looking on the up and up, so definitely thank you for that, April. Any questions as we fade out? Otherwise,
I would just add one comment. This is the first time I heard that it was in Hawaii. So then I looked back at my emails and I saw the save the date. My mom just retired from our tribe after 30 years in finance, and we just got back from Hawaii. I took her for her retirement.
Wonderful.
So
everything was going great over there?
Yeah, that's why I wanted to mention it, because I was so nervous about going. My mom's on dialysis, so very nervous about COVID. We're both vaccinated. Everything was very thorough all the way through. Once we had to have a negative test within 72 hours of entering Hawaii. You have to upload to an app. You have to have a QR code to scan. But once we had that done and it was uploaded to the app, it was so comfortable the whole way for anybody who's nervous or concerned. And everybody in Hawaii is very mindful of masking and social distancing. And so it was a really good experience. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you for that feedback, Marnie. We've all been interested on how is the travel going to affect us. And I do appreciate that. Thank you.
Absolutely.
So we look forward to May. We will have another Coffee with NAHRA the last Wednesday of the month. And if you haven't already, we are also having Leadership Essentials classes. The the Wednesday beforehand with Paradigm Shift, teaching us how to be better individuals and how we can lead and work with individuals on our team across different teams and everything else. So sorry, repetitive, but have a wonderful day. I do enjoy your time, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.